Before we get into the what if, I just want to say this is when the second intro pops up, and I have to admit it's as good as the first one, and I highly recommend you check it out yourself and just hearing what happens. And yeah. Clarity by Dragonsin, Chapter 19. Seek. The man let out a deep sigh to keep his nerves in check. This was it. He shouldn't be nervous about this, for the greater good, he whispered to himself. Then the door to his left opened. Clarity. This is the intro that I was talking about, by the way. Rose petals and ash blow through the wind as a smiling Ruby pulls the stoic Naruto around the field in an impromptu dance. The two stop briefly to look at each other. The total clarity fades in as roses and ash fly into the air. Child Ruby skips through the streets with a bright smile as she eats her ice cream. She stops as if sensing something behind her and turns around. Teenage Ruby looks up at the moon with a forlorn look on her face. Naruto walks through the streets, eating ice cream with a neutral expression. He stops and turns as if sensing something behind him. A teenage Naruto looks up at the sun with an emotionless expression. Ruby interacts with her team as they are quickly joined by Juniper. Yang grabs Ruby into a chokehold while Cardin watches their antics with a bored expression before suddenly butting heads with Nora for taking something from his plate. Naruto walks through the halls along with his team before being tackled by Neela as her team joins them. Itachi chuckles as the students struggle to pry the girl off of the blonde. Aspen sips from his mug as he looks from his balcony at his school along with his staff. Hiruzen takes a long drag from his pipe as Kakashi and Dogal sit on either side of him, like along with the other executives. Roman walks through the streets before turning to take a bow to the camera. A scene is shown of Naruto and Ruby fighting each other in the rain. Ruby hugs the Fox Max close to her chest. Naruto and Ruby sleep next to each other with her cloak draped over both of them. Naruto looks down at a rose emblem in his hand and gently rubs the thumb over it. The child versions look up slowly. They hold their hands out to each other, but they never touch. They reach for their weapons. Uh, the Ruby minus R stands back to back, fighting off Grim that come at them. Team 7 cut down approaching White Fang members that try to attack them. Jennifer put out their weapons and charge at the Grim. Team Shiva back up Team 7 with ease. Penny flies through the air before unleashing a powerful green energy blast, destroying everything in its place. Not too far, Sun watches on with an easy smile before jumping into the fray. Ruby fights one-on-one with Roman before moving away as the thief attempts to blast her. Naruto fights against another assassin, their ninjato clashing at high speeds before the other one delivers a kick that Naruto blocks but is still pushed away with. The two back away from their opponents. Their backs touch, causing them to turn around to look at each other, both of them seemingly surprised to see the other as roses and ash cover the screen. Child Ruby and Naruto are looking at each other. Ruby smiles while Naruto's expression doesn't change. A cloud passes them to show present time. Naruto and Ruby back in the field from the beginning, looking at each other as rose petals and ash lay around them. Clarity. They waited in silence, the cool night air nipping at their trepidation as the scattered moonlight sparkled off the surface of the water, a dim disco ball and a long, slow dance, a peaceful night that was perfect for what they were trying to do. I'm so bored, at least it would have, and not for his current companions. The blonde assassin turned around to see Ruby melting into the roof. Meanwhile, Penny was poking at the substance once known as Ruby Rose with a bright smile, unconcerned with her non-Newtonian state of boredom. They had been staking out the docks for the better part of an hour, and the dust shipment still wasn't here. What if this is all a waste of time? Ruby congealed enough to say, and Naruto could not refute this solid counter. Like him, she was banking on her target showing up at this specific location at the same time, and while all signs pointed at things being likely, that evidence was based on secondary information and hunches, pure hearsay. And Blake's my friend. I feel like I should be more trusting. As a leader, you cannot always be a friend. The blonde said so quietly she could barely hear him, following up with the icy tone she had come to expect. Insubordination cannot be tolerated. But she didn't disobey me, Ruby clarified. No, she abandoned you. The Faunus retorted with his voice dropping another few octaves and degrees, which is much worse. So cold that they burned, causing the other captain to flinch. Those who break the rules are trash, Naruto whispered, mouthing the words to himself, but those who abandon their allies are worse than trash. I was trash, he continued before Ruby had a chance to defend herself. I abandoned my teammate when they needed me. You did? She received a silent nod in confirmation. I have since mended that mistake and will never do it again. Glancing over his shoulder, he gave the silver-eyed girl his equivalent of a pointed look, meaning that his vacant face was tilted slightly forward so that the shadows did most of the emphasis. Not much to most people, but to her, it was like he had put makeup on his face. You need to make sure something like this never happens again. Yeah, maybe, but sometimes Ruby began, almost forgetting her own conviction in the face of this harsh economy. Sometimes you need to take a leap of faith. Faith? Believe it will work out. She dumbed down, something that was still strange for her since she was usually on the other end of this conversation. Ruby could practically see herself reflected in his steel blue eyes, floundering for words in the intensity of his stare. Just just trust that everything will work out the way you want it to. Trust your friends and have faith that everything will be okay in the end. However, this all became that much harder when the airships began appearing. There were four in total, and they seemed to be landing around the crate holding the dust shipments. They have arrived. The moment had passed, and the edge returned to his voice. Ruby couldn't deny the ache in her chest, though didn't know if it was because of this, or that she had been right about Blake. She also didn't give it much thought, reforging her determination with a deep breath like a bellows. She was here to find her teammate and bring her home. That's what mattered most right now. So she perched back into her nest and peeked through the scope of crescent rows to assess the situation. The three of them watched the airships descend and hover around the stack of crates like a murder of vultures coming in for their meal. Bay doors opening wide as hungry maws, and disgorging a full platoon of white-fanged soldiers in their pristine costumes, but also someone else, whose iconic bowler hat bobbed about the uniformity. Torchwick? Ruby questioned as the familiar carrot top strolled out of the bullhead like it was a lumicine and this, a typical Saturday night on the town, which, knowing the man, it very well could be. Do you know him, Ruby? Having already looked up all there was officially and unofficially known about the criminal, the only thing which remained a mystery to Penny was how her friend had become familiar with the crook. I fought him when he tried to rob a doll shop I happened to be in, the silver-eyed girl explained as her mind went back to that day, the day everything had changed for her, well, one of the days. And since then she had gotten used to the fact that boy next to her wouldn't react to this latest development. He and his team had by now established that Namekuji's theory about an alliance with the Veiled Thief and the White Fang was more than plausible. "There's Blake!" the silver-eyed girl squealed above the high-pitched whine of the bullhead's turbines. In those few seconds of inattention, the situation on the ground had changed once again. Torchwood was no longer the only one under her crosshairs. As Ruby's wayward teammate held the crook's neck under her blade, she seemed to be addressing the White Fang for some reason, but Ruby was too far away to tell what she was saying and could hardly read lips, like some annoying talented blondes. Not that it mattered, as something infinitely more important came to her attention. There was a shadow sneaking up on Blake. Its movement was subtle yet stark, and almost obvious in contrast to the swirl of debris being kicked up by the bullhead's backwash. Yet she might have missed it if not for her trained sniper eyes latching onto the smooth grip. An equally smooth movement that placed her fingers on the trigger as she waited for the shadow to make its move on her teammate, slowly came into focus in her optic until Ruby could make out a full humanoid. It was still just a silhouette, black like the matte steel targets on Beacon's outdoor range and almost invincible against the illuminated docks, but as it slithered into the halo from the bullhead's spotlight, she saw it. A mask, and not just any mask, not even the off-white type that was on every other faunus down there. This was one Ruby was far more familiar with, a similar type so often seen on the body laying prone next to her, which twanged like a bowstring as he also saw it. Is that? She took her eyes off the scene to interrogate him, but the assassin and his wooden expression were gone. The blonde had already raced towards his target at expert speed, massive ore reserves burning behind him like a contrain. It didn't take him long to reach the assailant, the assassin lookalike who appeared to mount a hasty defense just in time for Naruto to tackle them both out of her field of view and into an adjacent warehouse. Ruby watched as the two shadows crashed through the sheet steel building before going back to her own mission. Both Blake and Roman were staring slack-jawed at the trail of dust that led into the Acme-esque hole in the wall before they too returned to what they had been doing before the interruption. They were very quickly joined by another blonde that reminded Ruby of an older, more laid-back version of Naruto. She would check in on him later. Right now she had a teammate to support, so without another word the sniper left her perch, activated her semblance. She shot towards her teammate with speeds that would put even Kitsune and his anomalously fueled flight to shame. Unlike Kitsune's target, Toshiruk was caught completely unaware by the Crimson Reaper. He was helpless as her boots made contact with his midsection, sending him crashing into a crate. "Thanks for the help there, little Red." Sun smiled appreciatively over at the R of Ruby. "Don't call me that." Ruby scowled despite Sun's nice guy pose before looking over at Blake, who seemed far more shocked and indeed frightened of the Reaper than Roman had. "No time for that," she silently berated in a voice that distinctly sounded like him. "We're going to have a talk when this is all over," she stated to Blake. "Until then, let's keep the dust out of their hands. If we can somehow take out the airships, then they'll have no way of escape. Righty ho! Got Penny!" Ruby shrieked at her ginger's sudden appearance. "You gotta stop doing that!" And right after she had fully pumped herself up, "All that time wasted." "Oh, sorry, but there's no need to worry about the ships," Penny reassured, still with that impractical smile, regardless of the disbelief around her. "I can take care of them," Ruby answered smartly. "Are you sure?" "Of course I am." She smiled back reassuringly, even as an oily black substance oozed from her sleeves and slid over her hands like gloves. Fingers grew long and spitefully like icicles formed blades. It was as if her own shadow was swallowing her, darkness slipping over her spotless record the way a flumpy librarian transformed into a latex-clad dominatrix in the hormone-added minds of her teenage patrons. Patron saint of corruption, she was betrothed by two black gushers sprouted out of her back which arched into wings, tarry rainbows pulsating over her head in that pale light. Long gone was the happy-go-lucky girl. In place stood a fallen angel, a princess of darkness. Her dripping hands solidified into twin blades. At the same time she looked at Ruby, and a petulant smile cracked across her face. "I am mission ready." It was safe to say, however, that the mission was not ready for her. Ruby was nearly blown off her feet as Penny wings batted once and flew her at the bullhead like a slingshot. She was slated for a head-on collision with the aircraft, and Ruby rubbed the debris out of her eyes just in time to see the crew's horrified expression through the ballistic glass, as graceful as a feather in the breeze, though Penny's performed a vernier adjustment at the last second and merely tickled the cockpit. But before the White Fang inside could breathe a sigh of relief, they noticed they no longer had control of their altitude and positioning. Penny had severed the fuselage from the engines as easily as one plucks the wings from a fly, and as they plummeted the short distance to the ground, she was already on the next one. Seeing the demise of their squad mate, the second bulkhead pulled hard to port, presenting their broadside to the ghoulish girl so that she might fly in one cargo door and out the other. Instead, they attempted foolishly to shoot her down with the Gatling gun they had mounted there. The clearly homemade jerry-rigged contraption was no less effective in vomiting out a constant stream of bullets, every sixth of which was a tracer round that hit Penny but stuck like fireflies in a pint of gunness. The bullhead's efforts to escape punishment were just as futile, and as the girl passed through the craft it seemed to melt and collapse behind her. The White Fang's support system had crumbled, the third aircraft having already started to pull away, leaving the group and their comrades far behind. Their ascent was so steep that the aircraft nearly went into a stall, that momentarily sputtering of the engines just enough for Penny's wings to lash out like whips and seize the ship by its stringing wings. This didn't entirely stop the bullhead as they gunned the throttles past what the craft was rated for. The strain it would cause the frame wouldn't matter if they were to go down here. It didn't matter anyway, as the black substance didn't stop there either. It slithered into the aircraft's turbines and clogged the air intake, suffocating the engines, which died in sputtering turmoil. The aircraft jerked a few times towards the sky like a drowning man as its engine scuttered and then finally gave out. Ruby looked up just in time to see the last airship staring Penny down, revving its engines like a bull backed into the corner and pawing the ground in a desperate bid to bluff its way out. Penny responded by holding her bladed arms out in front of her. Aiming at the ship, their sharp edges suddenly melted, turned back into their liquefied states as the black substance began reshaping. Soon there was a large black cannon barrel in front of the Angel, mouth twice as wide as the crippling cheerful smile that was still painted on her face, like the shark mouths adorning the fighter planes of the infamous Flying Mantles. An ominous green light began to emit from somewhere at the bottom of that black barrel, and a moment later a giant laser blast shot from the cannon. The diffuse blast bathed the bullhead and pushed it back, but didn't seem to do much damage until it coalesced into a tight beam that went right through the metal like a sterilized needle through flesh, and the last enemy fell. Mission parameters complete, Penny chirped as she landed in front of Ruby, an explosion in the background capping her exclamation mark. Clarity. It was disconcerting, like staring into a mirror and not knowing the person looking back. Their outfit looked so much like the ones he and his team wore, a black flame-resistant polycotton that didn't make noise nor constricted movements, hugged the skin but had added padding for the knees and elbows. The front was also armored, covered in a dark gray vest, which matched the assailant's greaves and was equal in obscuring the person from almost down to the gender, but above all else, the mask held Kitsune's attention was black-white, a lack of markings or animal traits like the inverse of discovering a huge hulking zit in the center of his forehead. It made it obvious this person wasn't from his branch, and so Kitsune no longer had any apprehension about killing them where they stood, hunchbacked and expective, from the way the other assassin was reaching for the weapon strapped to their back. They thought the same. There was no more thinking, as both exploded in a flash of movement that would have been hard for even the speedy huntress to follow. Even his fawness eyes were useless in zero light, only slivers of moon in which to see, tiny sparks that cast off each time their blades connected. Strikes were enhanced as if it were all one big production, swords matching each other move for move. For Naruto, it was more comforting that this wasn't an imposter. As foolproof as a secret handshake, he knew that even if this assassin wasn't from his branch, they shared the same training, which was also why his opponent had been taken so off guard by his frontal charge, since it wasn't exactly becoming of an assassin to be so brazen, so it was time to be so again. It was a calculated risk, but one which was backed up by his unaccountable strength and unaccustomed rage. Naruto moved his sword behind him in a rat tail, feigning a defensive stance which the other assassin obliged by probing with a soft attack. That was when Naruto came round, swung his sword over his head in an arc that was as obvious as it was unavoidable, already committed to his own assault. His adversary raised his sword in a diagonal above his head to let the sloppy blow slide off like water on a roof. Everything about it was textbook, their technique and even their sword identical. The difference came the moment their weapons touched, like an electrical spark transmitting the foreign assassin that he had made a grievous error, but it was too late, and he was immediately forced to a knee, steel cracking like bones. The smaller assassin was pressing down on him with more than just his body weight, what felt like a mountain on top of him. He had to get out, not to acquiesced, kicking the other assassin squarely in the stomach and sending him hurtling into the wall, which dented like his armor plate. Breathless and dazed, but the unknown assassin still managed to defend against the one from Vale as he came in to finish him off. His sword was not so lucky. That crack he heard had been a hairline fracture, one which Naruto trusted to be there when their blades met again. He felt the edge of his ninjato catch the crack like a finger finding a keyhole in the dark, and then with an open palm on the back of his blade he slammed it down home. The other assassin's blade shattered, Naruto saw following through to carve an angry gash at his enemy's mask. In thwarted desperation, his opponent snatched the tip of his fractured blade before it fell and sliced at Naruto's arm on the backstroke. Naruto merely grunted as adrenaline muted the pain to nothing more than the, the prickling of a thorn. The problem was that it also dulled his reflexes, his commitment to strong arming his opponent making his retaliation sloppy. As he twisted around for a punch, the other assassin easily ducked under it, letting the younger assassin's fist sink into the wall, while he jabbed the broken hilt of his sword up towards Naruto's rib cage. Still embedded into the wall, Naruto dropped his elbow and knocked the stubbed sword out of the man's hand. That was where he met the assassin's eyes, gazing through the mask's thin slits only to see another resting behind like a coiled snake, a pair of golden eyes strikingly similar to the huntress's fondest teammate. He remarked right before they struck him with a headbutt like a cobra. Naruto's fist was freed from its raccoon trap as he was sent skidding back, but not before the leather binds on his left arm snapped like a tether, jerking him off balance. His left arm was out of its socket, right arm posting down like landing gear to steady himself, and the rest his backward slide. The cut on his forehead, unaccountably painful, filled muscles screaming as they tensed, almost making him overlook the alarm bells ringing in his head. He ducked, letting the glowing hooked fang pass over his head, a sickly yellow, sickle-like blade of light, shade greener than his own blond hair, which stood on end and was trimmed like wheat. The other assassin had one in each talon of his hand, stance casting a dagger of a smile on his blank white canvas. Kitsune grimaced. He dodged the next few slashes, bending in the same breeze which tasted his perspiration with a forked tongue. He felt the other assassin's otherworldly weapon get uncomfortably close. There was something vile about them, yet familiar, like the tang of poison in which he was all too experienced. He knew he couldn't let them touch his skin. Too bad, Naruto-kun. Not but a graze caused by that momentary distraction. He ignored the tendons in his right arm severing like celery stalks, didn't hear his sword clattering on the warehouse floor as he was called out by name. That voice. He knew that voice, but it wasn't yellow, it was crimson. Rage, hate, anger. But you could have been so much better. All these things threatened to spill out of him like blood. Blood dripped like a leaky pipe. It was just a shallow cut. Sweet hung of the pin incense in his cheek. His mask, where was it? Where was he? Hell? Underground? Sewer? Scum. Focus. He was trash? No, no, he was better than this. Here, let me show you. A thought which lasted just as long as his childhood. Kitsune considered closing his eyes, looking away, running away, as far as his stubby little legs could carry him. Let's trim that tail, for your small sacrifices are necessary. One life to save thousands. Grim outnumber us 100 to 1. If the law of the land is survival of the fittest, we're already on the wrong side of it. There is no right and wrong, only order and those who behave like animals, crawling on all fours. Something gripped him, held him at bay like those straps on his arm, and their pungent magic leapt the bloodlust chain down as if they were fastened to the floor. He could hardly move, barely dodged the other assassin's charge with one arm hanging useless and the other actively dragging him down. He was playing with Kitsune as a cat bats at string. Another swipe passed over his left arm, nearing the shoulder. The whole tricep went numb, shut down like a powder grid as he stumbled backwards. At the same time, a light went on Kitsune's head. A backup generator growled in his chest as he realized that not only was his own body fighting him, his attacker was spaciously targeting the seals on his arm, trying to release the monster under lock and key. Chains around his heart writhed. What was this that gripped him, slowed his reactions like a fly in a spiderweb? Was this fear? Why don't you lay it out, Naruto-kun? They had danced back around to the hole through which they had crashed into the warehouse. Fragile moonlight wafted in like the salty air, but was overpowered by the more piquant bodily excretions. Other bodies outside, in the motions of their own battles, played like shadow puppets on the floor. The huntresses in their own fight couldn't have been more desperate. You work so hard to keep it balled in. Why? No one else has to. They all get to humor their emotions, fear, anger, joy. They all resent you, you know. Those huntresses, your own team. You feel their distrust, their antipathy. You feel, so why don't you pretend that you don't? He might have been ashamed to admit it, and shame was something Naruto did know. Shame was failure, unaffordable, unavailable, that he wondered what these other things felt like. Part of him wanted to indulge, unbridge his rage, let it loose on confusion, and feast upon the naive doubts that Huntress had laid in front of him. All these thoughts he had been chewing on since then. He lusted to rip and shred, tear them apart with his bare hands. But Gigi had made him promise. He had promised himself never to be weak again, never to be used. Just hold still. His right arm shot out, held his opponent's wrist with the sound of someone on the old Vanley sofa scooting to the edge of their seat. A needle slipping off a record, the mantra in the head was sent crashing to the floor at the same time the broken muscle in his arm healed, twanged like a guitar riff, and a rumbling bass line startled in his throat. His mouth lip synced to something he'd heard before. Screw you, bastard! Between cutting his teeth on the forbidden sweetness of invective and snapping his enemy's forearm, it was impossible to say which was the more satisfying. The design factor finally nailed sealing the coffin he delivered with a kick. His heel fell snugly into the divot he'd already put in his opponent's armor like a marble in sterling checkers, skipping across the border. Oh, to crash. He encountered two thumps and a cacophony of noise, something heavy collapsing atop his adversary. In that warehouse full of unknown quantities, he let out an echoing breath and tried to point a mental picture of the other assassin's demise on the blackboard in front of him. No good. This wasn't satisfying. He wasn't Sai. He didn't have the ability to turn mental draining into reality. Naruto could just have to add the finishing touches himself, make sure this ghost from his past didn't get back up. He picked his way forward cautiously, feet like an ant's antenna probing the air in front of him. Though lacking creativity, Naruto could perfectly visualize things as they were. Where his sword lay in this mess of a battlefield, he found it with the toe of his boot, kicking it deftly up into his hand as he continued scooting silently as possible towards the enemy assassin. But his very next step was as if onto a trampoline, knee wobbling, sense of balance and placement of everything in that cavern's room suddenly dangerously askew. Seems like the poison's finally taken effect. There was a hint of grudging relief in his opponent's saccharine tone, but no hitch, no sign of broken ribs or collapsed lungs as the other assassin dug himself out of the pile of debris. He merely grunted as he reset the two halves of his radius and ulna. Naruto was seeing double now, fiercely chasing the phantasmal doppelganger. as they pinballed back and forth in his eye sockets like too many 24-hour stints and an overdose of Namikuji stimulants. With your mentalism, I doubt it would last long. The Ocelots were lathering over even as the foreign assassin closed the distance between them. Naruto wasn't sure which to defend himself against, lurching left and right, always too sluggish to catch up to the hallucinatory mirage as they skipped over to the furthest peripheries of his vision. But in the meantime, that shouldn't keep us from having a little bit of fun. The pain was immense. Impact from a simple bare fist punch to his gut disrupted his entire torso. Rather than being diffused, though, the sensation seemed heightened, as if the toxin in his bloodstream made his veins into telegraph wires to let the rest of his body share in the one-way conversation. After all, it's not like we can want to kill you, waste all that talent and effort, just keep you in your place. Though he seemed to be doing a pretty good job with the former, kicking Naruto around like the empty soda can which served in place of a ball in those neighborhood of honest new games. Not that Naruto had ever participated, just observed other children acting their age before they were also forced to grow up too late. You seem to have forgotten what this is. You've lost sight of the goal. You're confused, dazed, woozy, more like it. But if Naruto could just identify which of the three images attacking him was the real one, though one can hardly blame the tool for its misuse. That senile fool Sarutobi is trying to turn an axe into a pruning shear. His enemy's voice was grinding in his ears. Everything he tried to grab onto had a rose's thorn. Or perhaps it's that huntress who has you mixed up. She's got you thinking you can be a real person. Her face appeared amid the haze and false memories, a rose petal floating on a choppy pond. Her hand breached the surface of his ceruleum, trying to keep him from drowning in his own froth, and the weight of his indulgence pulling him down. What, you really are? The other assassin lifted his leg and shook it along with Naruto's grasping hand, limp like an undone shoestring. It's pathetic. Scuffing his boot on Naruto's face, he kicked him onto his back, but failed to dislodge his hand, which clung on like a piece of gum on a hot summer's day. The assassin scoffed, winding up to try again, but wound up dragging the living ball and chain closer. Pushing past his bruised and swollen cheek, the downed assassin lifted his head and sunk his teeth into his attacker's ankle. You little! His heart throbbed in his ears, head pounding with the strikes the other assassin rained down on him, but this only made him clamp down all the tighter, feeling as if he were to let go, he would lose all control and sink further into dark and merciful oblivion, a place he wanted to go back to as little as the cold, concrete prison cell that had been his home for the first 6 years of his life. No, no, no. He was just beginning to see the shadows on the wall for what they were. The shadows were creeping in, his vision dimming as ice swelled up. I'm not going to kill you, prying the blonde back up by his hair. The blank-masked assassin held Naruto aloft and glared at him with angel-eyed slits. No, as faulty as you are now, you still have the potential to be as useful a pawn. But it would be better for both of us if you were to be indisposed of for a while. With his other hand, the foreign assassin flexed his aura control and again manifested one of his glowing blades. It wandered above Naruto's torso like a desert fork looming over a buffet, looking for the best way to round out the night. At the same time, can't risk you recovering too soon. I can already tell that the neurotoxin is wearing off. Indeed, the hallucinations were slipping to the back of his mind like blood sliding down his throat, and the huntress's images being pushed to the fore. Either way, the bigger problem is going to be that girl. I get the feeling that she can't be persuaded to leave well enough alone, can't she? And pity for her, she's more delicate than you are. Neither of them was playing a subtle game, not behaving as assassins should. This might have bothered Naruto at one time, but as his opponent's own healing factor meticulously through that bite, things were becoming ever so clear. The blood in his mouth seemed to turn into nitroglycerin as it dripped into his gullet. Emotions, tired of being locked away, dripped away, buried up through his esophagus. Stomach acid stripping away the lining in his guts, along with false pretenses. Sorry, but I can't have you unleash that right now. The other assassin held him at arm's length like an ordinary kitten, at the same time bringing his other hand with its clawed blade up to Naruto's neck. Besides, I think it will be busy enough keeping you alive. Naruto held his breath along with the bile in his throat as a low whistle rent the air. His body hit the ground with a deep thump. There was blood. So much blood. Dot 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 dot. Why was there blood? Well, forever blank-faced, the foreign assassin stared at the arm which once held Kitsune, now barely held onto his own elbow by a bundle of tendons like a frayed rope. Seconds clicked by as the pendulum swung limply, the distant crack of a rifle chiming the final hour. That was unexpected.